King, the comforter, the spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Well, good evening, everyone. I have a little smaller group tonight, and though I wonder if the rain kept anyone away. Interestingly, it feels a little warmer since it did rain than it has on some of the other days of late. But here we are. We've gotten to already the ninth discourse. It's hard to believe we made it so far. Hopefully, made a little bit of spiritual progress along the way. Before we jump in, I guess, always with some trepidation, is there any questions, burning questions from the floor before we jump in? No, not today. All right, so this discourse today is on falsehood. And as with so many of these, it really hits close to home. It does. It reminded me of, there's a collection of sayings from the Obstinate Elders, one that was published with the title, Living Without Hypocrisy. And I think you might have that be a subtitle of this chapter, of how to live without hypocrisy. How do we live truly? How do we live without falsehood? So it's something we'll strive for. So let's jump in and see today. So, brothers, he writes, I want to remind you of a few things about falsehood. For I see that you are not very careful about controlling your tongues. And from this, we easily are carried off into many other faults. Well, I think he can still see us today, can't he? You see, brothers, in all human affairs, as I'm always telling you, there are habits which tend either to good or to evil. And there is much need for watchfulness, lest we be robbed by falsehood. For no one who lies is linked to God. Otherwise, God would be a liar. As it's written, falsehood is of the evil one. And again, the devil is a liar and the father of lies. You see, he calls the devil the father of falsehood. God is the truth. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's something we see even from the book of Genesis, isn't it? It was the devil in the form of a snake who first introduced that falsehood, to say that God was a liar, that what he had spoken was not true, to first deceive mankind. And so this way of falsehood, as he makes very clear, is always a pathway away from God, away from him who is the truth. See how we sort ourselves out, and what position we take up through lying, clearly on the side of the evil one. If therefore we want to be saved, we must with all our hearts love the truth and guard ourselves from every kind of falsehood, so that we may not be separated from truth and from life. Okay, so there's the point. He's going to get into different types of falsehood. But before we even do that, one of the reasons helps us to realize is why does this falsehood or deception enter into us so much? And isn't it for no other reason than for our vanity, for our ego so often, that we want to be thought of better than we are, or we don't want to take responsibility for something. We try to be complicated people, and yet the gospel calls us to be more simple. And we sometimes get into this way of thinking that it would be better just to not be straightforward about, say, what happened or what we believe or what we're saying, but yet we find that the lies and one thing leads to another are actually create far more stressful and convoluted and complicated way of living than just to simply live in the truth and in simplicity. So let's hear, because this is kind of, as with many of these, this hits so close to home when he describes the three kinds of falsehood. So there's man who lies in his mind or in his imagination, the man who lies in his word, that's in his speech, and there's the man who lies in his very life. The man who lies in his mind, so we'll go through this, because the first one, so he's saying basically in thought and word in our life, and the word is probably the easiest to understand. one who lies in one's life might be the definition of hypocrisy, right? But the first one, to lie in one's mind, is a very interesting one. So let's hear where he's going with this. The man who lies in his mind is one who is given to conjectures. If he sees someone talking with his brother, he's suspicious and says, "They're talking about me." And if they stop their conversation, he conjectures that they stop because of him. If anyone should say one word, he suspects that it's to annoy him. And it's simply everything he says about his neighbor. He did this on my account. He said this about me, or he did that for this reason. This man is being a liar in his mind. Nothing he says is true, but only a suspicion. Out of this comes useless investigations, slander, deceptions, quarreling, rash judgments, and the like. He goes on, there's really, I'd say, probably two parts to this. The first one he highlights is when we're so caught up in ourselves, right? We start imagining things from other people that, as you say, they're talking about me, they're saying this about behind my back, people are out to get me. Almost sounds like the definition of some kind of paranoia psychologically, which it can be, but everyone to some degree or another might be prone to it if we're not careful. But the other way, and I can say I've certainly encountered this no small number of times during the pandemic, is the tendency to think the worst of people or situations. And so something's happening that I don't understand. Somebody made a decision that I don't understand, or on the surface I don't, and I immediately jump to the worst. I assume the worst about that person. I assume ill intention. I assume that they're whatever it may be. And yet it's sort of the opposite of the gospel. That love hopes all things, believes all things, expects all things. In other words, to really give someone the benefit of the doubt. To go even more so, I'm sorry, I won't digress into another one, but it's something too, at least we don't even know when we're already jumping to the bad conclusions. So
I think something that I had been told once, where it's like it's very easy to jump to the worst situation, because there've been times when it's been proven right, but I know I have been told, even if you're right, don't think it. Like, even if you're correct, don't even go there. Choose to try to think the best of people.
It's because we really say, as he says in another discourse, we don't know the struggle, we don't know what's behind it, and it brings us into a very dark world, in all truth, and in that kind of state, it's a miserable existence, and sometimes we find ourselves in a miserable state. We take a step back. It's very often we've cultivated this kind of thinking. So he goes on. Then there comes an occasion when what he suspects is found to be true. We just heard here. And then what? At this point he says he wants to correct himself. And so he spends a lot of time thinking, I see someone speaking against me, and what is the fault of which he's accusing me? I shall correct it of myself. It took a little turn there, but he's saying, so sometimes, I might try to imagine things for the better. So they're seeing my fault. They see that I'm really, I don't know, maybe I'm very careless about something, and I start imagining they're saying this, and then I said I better be less careless. But he says even this, it's not going to bear fruit, even if it causes me to try to be less careless. So what does he say? This sort of thing is from the devil right from the beginning, because it began in a falsehood. For not knowing, he suspected what he did not know. How can a rotten tree bring forth good fruit? So it's a kind of a convoluted thing. So he's describing a situation where I'm imagining someone else is seeing my fault, and then I'm wanting to correct that fault. He says, so even if I'm correcting something in myself, that maybe I'm going to try to be more attentive, because I'm imagining that I don't know, Michael over here is just seeing how inattentive I am, and I'm just thinking, oh, he's really just noticing how I'm so inattentive. And then so I'm going to try to be more attentive because of that. Dorotheos says, no, this is terrible. Even if it causes me to be a more attentive person, it's going to cause me more harm than good in the long run, because a bad tree cannot bring good fruit, since it's coming from this sort of, it's bound up in falsehood. So he said, just don't go there with your thoughts. Just don't go there. If he really wanted to correct himself, whenever a brother said to him, don't do that, or why did you do that, Let him not be troubled, but bow and acknowledge his fault, and to thank his brother for correcting him. Then he will really be cured of his faults. So in other words, he says, if somebody actually were to point out directly to us in the other chapter, then we get upset and we self-justify, right? So he's saying instead of trying to imagine things about what people are saying or not saying, just try to be humble about it, whatever they might say.
So maybe just kind of taking it as it is.
As it is,
and
just
not
simply.
really reading more into it. Is that what he's saying?
Right, and to take people's words for what they are. We often, and of course, being married, we sometimes can read between, try to read more into what each other says, and that doesn't necessarily go to. Very often wrong about it. I know I am. Say, oh well, what does she really mean when she says this? And no, what Abba Dorotheos is trying to say is just let's take each other at our word, and simply go with that. And if we do that, we'll just have a lot more peace. We won't be caught up in all this conjecture, all this confusion, all this falsehood, but we'll just be more simple. We'll live more like the gospel. So let him. Okay, for God sees that such is the meekest. If such is his meekness, he will never let him go astray. But to correct myself, I shall trust my conjectures, and to always be suspicious, and to spend a lot of time in self-examination, is the justice of the devil when he's trying to betray you. That's a little bit confusing, but what we could say is that sometimes we really tend to overthink things, and really self-analyze to a degree that is not good. It's kind of a bit of a fine line, because in the Christian life we're called to a certain degree of reflection, right? We talked about before that examination of conscience, listening to our heart, especially before bed, that practice of a couple minutes quieting ourselves to confess of ways we've fallen short, ask for God's help, and then to go to sleep in peace and begin a new day. But there is a way where we can go too far with all of this, and we can get into all kinds of hypotheticals and what ifs, and then we start thinking about what other people are thinking, what I should have, would have, could have done, and it's just not helpful. So, all that to say, to just simply be more straightforward, I guess. At the time when I was in the cenobium, so that's in the communal monastery, I was tempted to deduce from the behavior of a man the state of his soul. So now he's going to describe his own temptation like this as a young monk. So Abba Dorotheos, he obviously was a very sensitive soul. He had this discernment even for a while. And so he said, I would sometimes get this temptation. I feel like I could get a window into someone's soul when I was young, and I didn't quite know what to make of that. Once a woman was carrying a pitcher of water and passed by where I was standing at prayer, and my mind was carried away. I don't know how, but I was struck by the look in her eyes, and my thought suggested me that she was a harlot. And when this suggestion came to me, I was troubled and revealed it to Abba John. So he didn't know what to do. He said, my thoughts are just puzzling me. Am I just being judgmental? Is this an intuition? What do I do with this? And Abba John said, Abba Dorotheos saying, Master, if without wishing to, I see someone's behavior, and my thoughts suggest to me the state of his soul, what should I do? The old man cleared up this point for me. He said, surely, supposing a man had an innate urge to do certain things, and by fighting against it overcame it, you would not think you could learn the state of his soul from this. Never put your trust in suspicions, where wrong premise leads right reasoning to a wrong conclusion. So I have to stop there, because the first part takes some explanation. What he's saying is, even if you are right for a moment, you have no idea the internal battle or where it's going to lead or where it goes. So it's like so he said, for one, you may be wrong, but two, say you got a snapshot for that moment. You have no idea where this is going to end and the battle that's going on inside. So just don't go the way of suspicions.
It's not just like you're talking about a snap judgment of a person, which is
yeah, basically.
That's something I do all the time. It's just
We
like,
do. We size up somebody, and then we say, we went back to that danger he warned us early on of saying that this is a certain type of person, and how ill a judgment it is to place, if you will, a label, to put somebody into a box that you are like this or like that. And then he goes on, the second phrase, which was kind of, I had to stop a few times to see. So wrong premises lead right reasoning to a wrong conclusion. So it means if we start out with falsehood, even if all of our other reasoning is sound, we're following all the logical path, we're going to end up in a wrong place. So that if you start with falsehood, you're going to end up wrong. It doesn't matter how right your path is after that. So don't go there. Dorothea.
Hi.
So continuing on. Okay. Suspicions are falsehood and blind your mind. Even my thoughts suggested to me about the sun. So even my thoughts suggested to me about the sun, this is the sun. Or about darkness, this is the darkness. I would not believe them. Nothing is more serious than suspicion. Nothing it brings the mind so much blindness, because it entertains them for a while and then begin to persuade us until we're convinced that we've seen things which do not exist and never could exist. So first illustration is a little bit, I did a little bit too far, but he's saying do not be so suspicious of things and of people, because if we start to play this game where we're always on the lookout for what somebody's up to, and we've probably found this in ourselves before. We've encountered it in someone else, right? When we're starting to see suspicions around every corner, or this person's up to no good. Certainly, we see that. So what can happen with that? He tells us another story, and the stories, they can be a little extreme, but they help to illustrate the point, to be memorable. So he says, I'll tell you a wonderful thing I saw from the beginning to the end when I was still in the cenobium. So when he was a monk in that communal monastery, something else he saw. We had a brother there whose mind was crammed with this kind of trouble, and he repeatedly was misled by his own suspicions. So there's a brother who's always kind of suspecting the worst. He's letting his thoughts run wild. And so one day, he said, falling prey to the devil, he was certain he saw this brother go out before liturgy into the field and eat a fig. Now, if you know the Orthodox practice before communion, you normally keep a fast from the time you wake up until after you receive Holy Communion, and then you would go have breakfast. And so he was certain, he was on the lookout. He saw this brother go and eat a fig, and then he was going to go to church and receive communion. And so, what did he do? Well, he was on the lookout, and just to see if the brother would go and receive communion. And we saw the brother washing his hands to go to prepare for communion. Interesting side note. So we see that in that practice they were receiving communion by the hand, as was often in the early church. But another discussion aside. So then he went off to run and tell the abbot that what had happened, and to stop him, so that the abbot would say wouldn't let him commune. So he went and told on him, right? So the abbot took him aside privately and said, "Tell me, brother, what did you do this morning?" He was taken in surprise and said, "Where, Father?" And the abbot said, "In the garden. You went very early this morning. What did you do there?" The brother was even more astonished and said, "I wasn't in the garden this morning, Father, nor was I even in the cenobium at dawn. I just got back from a journey. Immediately after the rising bell, the cellarer sent me on an errand, the business of which he spoke was several miles away, and he had only just returned in time for liturgy. And so the abbot sent for the cellarer to ask him, 'Did you really send the brother there today?' And the cellarer confirmed just what the brother had said, namely, they sent him to a certain man in the village, and then he knelt down and said, 'Forgive me, Father,' because he was absent from vigils, and for this reason could not receive the blessings. And the abbot was convinced, and he dismissed the two and sent them to communion." Okay, so clearly the first brother just imagined the whole thing, didn't he? And he called the brother back who had been suspicious, and he rebuked him severely, and he forbade him to receive Holy Communion. And not only this, after the liturgy he called all the monks together, and in tears he told them what had happened, and made an example of the brother, because he had a triple purpose in doing this. The first was to confound the devil, and to show him up as the sower of suspicions, In other words, to reveal what damage being suspicious can cause. The second was to allow the brother to make amends for his fault and be forgiven, and to receive help from God thereafter, and to put the brethren more on their guard against letting themselves be persuaded by their own suspicions. Having admonished both of us and the brother at great length about this, he said, "Nothing is more harmful than suspicions, as we see by what has happened." I can tell you without getting too specific, I've come up as people have told me that they have imagined, some of the precautions we're taking for liturgy, or with kind of in terms of for the coronavirus times, and have imagined some very nefarious things with it by letting suspicions run wild, and as if it's this, I won't get into it that much, but this great dishonor or lack of reverence, or just things which are not true at all, and revealed to be as soon as they're expressed. But I would never know until they were expressed, nor would any of us. So sometimes we have to, if we find we're getting kind of carried away with some of these things, it is very beneficial to talk to a priest or spiritual father, or someone to kind of get out of our heads if we've gotten that far. But better yet, to not even go down the road of suspicion.
I think the thing that I guess for myself that I'm hearing is that makes it, trying to live without suspicion difficult, at least for me, is I really want to protect myself. I want to protect my pride. I want to protect my ego. I want to protect my own image of myself. And so it's this whole thing of, you want to not be taken in. You don't want to be hurt. You don't want to be, taken advantage of. And so I guess I'm seeing that this really requires being open and vulnerable and being okay with that.
That's a great insight. It really is, because to live the Christian life the way the gospel instructs us, it takes a certain courage. It takes a certain vulnerability, because we can get hurt, and we do hurt each other, sadly. And there are times in which, say we have to, not everyone can live the gospel perfection at all times. I don't know that we're all capable of that degree of vulnerability, though it's helpful to have the image of Christ before us. But we certainly need to strive for that a little bit more. The fact that we can get let down, that we can get hurt.
Well, then,
but the opposite is,
and not hold on to those hurts, that's
yes.
The goal.
But even more, I think if we do that, we'll find more often than not, we will be very pleasantly surprised that people will often kind of respond better than we think, and that there's more good in people than we think. This is something I think that's a very, very important aspect of it. Very important aspect of it as well. Well, thank you. So as it goes on, it says, the fathers tell us many such things in different ways to secure us against the harm or suspicions due to us. Let us strive with all our power never to put our trust in our own conjectures. For nothing separates us so completely from God, or prevents us from noticing our own wrongdoing, or makes us busy about what does not concern us, as this. No good comes from it, but only troubles without number, and they leave no time to acquire the fear of God. Should worthless suspicions germinate in our minds, let us turn them into charitable thoughts, and they will not harm us. So this is something which he touches on, one of the ways to fight against it. So the thought, remember, we have no control over the thoughts that come to us initially. We have control over whether we accept them, what we do with them, right? A thought comes into our head. It's not a sin. It's just a thought, right? Thoughts can be good or bad or noise or junk. But what thoughts do we cultivate and dwell on? What thoughts do we just let go or reject? That's so much of the internal battle of the heart. And he says, so turn the negative ones into charitable ones. So I'm suspected to think poor of someone. Say someone shows up late to church. Instead of saying, oh boy, so-and-so's late for church again, say, wow, they really made the effort to be here. I'm sure it must have been a struggle. It's not easy to get to church, especially in these times. And here, you know what? They made it. And so there's ways in which you can look at the same situation, the same facts, in a dark light or in a light sometimes. Not always the case, but very often we can, if we just try a little bit, we can do that. I've talked a little. Let me stop back for a second. Does anyone else have something they want to add or mention right now? Or ask?
Kind of, in that way though, if you're, I think what comes to mind, I think Father Seraphim Rose said, like, you know, be always like ready to make excuses for others, you know, in terms of that. But is that also not entering into a falsehood potentially? Of, okay, we talked about things that we think about ourselves that's actually in delusion, but does that also not apply to others? And yes, we want to think the best of others. We don't want to condemn anyone or judge anyone, but like, is there a way to balance that, or is that simply like, that's the gospel and that's Christ, and deal with that?
No, that's a great question, and make sure I came across the question is about, is it not, you know, we're encouraged to always think the best of people, to make, you know, sense to try to make excuses even if we see someone, you know, who's fallen into that. And what's a scriptural example that comes to mind? For example, you know, of this, even the sons of Noah. There's that example, right? When he first at the ark, they say he was the first kind of planted a vineyard, discovered wine, and kind of not having much experience, he drank too much and kind of fell asleep without any clothes on. And one of the sons, kind of came and laughed at his dad and wanted to show the others. And the other two sons kind of, you know, rebuked him. And it says that they carried a sheet backwards. They walked and they covered their father's nakedness. And the example, the image for that's carried through all of this is that on one hand, they saw what happened, but they covered over it. They weren't drawing attention to the fault or the failing, but rather they sought to help, to be kind of with compassion, if you will. Think about how God relates to us, right? He sees us more clearly than we could ever imagine, with all of that bad stuff in us, too. And yet He also sees the good things, and He loves us more than we can imagine, in spite of that. So God, He sees the whole of us, but He especially looks to our potential, to what is good in us, to what we can become. And in that way, which is to say, I think it's within that perspective that we don't necessarily have to be blind or pretend that not to see things that, you know, are objectively there. But because we're so prone to fall on the other side, to fall into criticism, judgment, negativity, and so on, to go the way of compassion, the way of the cross, the way of cutting people some slack. I think that's sort of where the gospel encourages us in that regard. So I don't know if it, and maybe there is kind of can get a fuzzy line sometimes, but I think on there the way we're encouraged to is to err on the side of giving people the benefit of the doubt rather than to err on the side of being too hard. One thing, again, another sphere in which this comes up, just as a warning, is there's all kinds of gossip sites on the internet too. That's probably the form of these times. There's certainly the church gossip sites. I think there's the political ones. Probably whatever thing that has a site, you can find that. I just warned you to be careful of that, because when they do, they can often take. I've seen it with church news, or the latest scoops, but it happens in politics. It happens in everything. There is almost always the tendency to take some fact or partial truth. It's very often a partial truth, maybe not even be right, and to immediately interpret the worst. And I can tell you, I've seen so many times where very often even the premises themselves were wrong. And so you can get down a very dark path without even knowing. And that's why we have to be very...
Can you give an example, Father?
I just hesitate to, because I think if there's some of these internet sites where they will be picking on, especially whatever Bishop so-and-so said and did, and whatever, Father so-and-so said this, and here's the latest, here's the latest financial scandal here, and whatever scandal there. And, sometimes, and I say sometimes there can be certain facts to it, but to immediately run to the worst, very often you don't get the whole story, and you get people in the darkest light, and all kinds of just stuff gets thrown around, where when it's divorced from the people, from the relationships, from the normal processes of how things should be handled. And in the church it should be handled as a family, in a community, that there is accountability. There is a mutual accountability, but St. Paul was very clear and very hard on the Corinthians, or those who wanted to solve the church's problems in secular courts. He said it's such a failing. It's such a failing if you don't rather, on one hand, accept a little bit of wrong from others, but also just to work each other out. Don't you know that the saints will judge the world? So that here you can't even just work things out among yourselves. So I guess it's been a problem around since the beginning, but I don't know. So it's definitely something there. I mean, on the other sphere on the policy, so there are different parties and different viewpoints, and we of course know objectively that not all politicians are the most straightforward, honest people, but we shouldn't necessarily assume that every single one of them is then completely corrupt, and nor should we assume that everyone who is of a certain, always has ill intentions or the worst intentions, or is part of some grand scheme to, I don't know, to enslave us all. And I mean, I'm sorry, there's a lot of grand conspiracy theories going on and that are out there, and maybe there are some. I mean, it takes a great faith in the coordination of a lot of people to work together. Anyway.
Okay, can I give like a weird one that I hope is not too explosive? I grew up in Colorado, and I couldn't tell you where exactly this came from, but the people in my family would agree that we were always conditioned to think, or we were always told, that California is the worst place to homeschool. It is the worst place to homeschool. In fact, it is outlawed in California. It's so bad. Don't move to California if you want to homeschool. Well, lo and behold, I married a Californian, and I moved to California, and California, actually, the state of California will pay homeschool families the school funds to homeschool their kids. And so I was raised with this oh, it's an awful, and so I think that's a situation where the premise was clearly wrong.
Yeah, the premise that California is some liberal place, that it's all bad if you're...
That somehow this is the worst place to be. I was well, that's actually not true.
Yeah.
That's actually not true. Not to say that California is perfect or whatever, but the things that I had, or at least that I had heard on the internet through my different connections in different circles, were completely not correct.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so this sort of thing can happen in all spheres of life, where you have a premise, especially when it's a negative one, and it really can darken your whole experience of a person or a situation, when there's just can be so much more to it. So maybe we'll think of some more examples later, but that's a great one.
Yeah,
Thank you, dear.
thanks.
So as regards falsehood in words, so we talked about falsehood in thought, and that was an interesting one, because it's one we don't often think about very much, that idea of negative suspicions. Now, so falsehood in word, this is what I mean. Suppose a man shirks getting up for vigils. Of course, he's at a monastery, right? But what's the thing the monk's supposed to do? To get up to pray, right? That's your main job, is to pray. So somebody he shirks getting up for vigil, and instead of saying honestly, "Forgive me, Father, I hadn't the guts to get up." How many of us would
Actually say that? I wouldn't.
He says instead, "I was feverish," or "I felt giddy," and giddy. That's kind of an interesting translation, or "I was unable to get up. I was too weak, I wasn't because I wasn't feeling well, right? We might put on our excuse for being late to school or something. Did we ever do that? A whole string of lies to avoid kneeling and humbling himself and seeking forgiveness. So this is really kind of nails the condition with so much of what we do. We just can't fess up to it and simply say, like, I messed up, or I didn't do it, or I was...
Or even I had a bad intention, where it was just like, I didn't want to do it,
Right. And just to say honestly what it was and accept the consequence. It's very hard to fight against that. I remember just in myself when I had my secular job before this at the state of California, I'm trying very specifically to fight against that tendency. If there was ever something that wasn't quite right in my work, to not try to justify why it was, but it was interesting to see the internal battle that would happen, because it wasn't, most of the time you have drafts of it, it's not like the final, it wasn't, ever a terrible situation, but we have this fallen sense to always want to assume that our work was perfect and not to just take responsibility. Oh, I forgot to do that piece, or I wasn't proofreading it carefully enough, or I actually made that mistake. Just to simply let that be. It's very interesting, the kind of battle that will go on inside ourselves sometimes to try to as we sort of try to minimize that. And this whole idea carries up very much to the practice of trying to make a confession a good confession, because this is a whole bigger topic, but the challenge for ourselves to really make a good confession before God is to simply say what we did without making excuses. And the more we can do that, the more powerfully God's grace acts, the more quickly we are healed, the more powerfully we receive the strength to continue the struggle. Because the opposite happens, that if I can't really say what I did, I'm not really repenting, so God's grace can't really work on me, so I can't really be forgiven and given strength in the struggle. It's interesting, but it can be so hard for the fallen self to do that.
I find it interesting that it's my fallen self is so willing to try to think the best of myself but think the worst of others. Where it's like I'm not willing to kind of cut the same slack for others that I totally want to give myself.
Yeah, that's right. I want to make sure it came up on the recording. So this is our tendency, our very fallen tendency we almost all have, to think the best of ourselves, or to be ready to give ourselves every excuse for why we didn't do something, but to be extremely exacting to everyone else. Whereas the Christian perspective, the perspective we're trying to go toward, to cultivate, I think, Michael, you had touched on earlier, is to be cutting everyone else slack and to be stricter on oneself. And that's stricter in the sense of accountability, of sort of that brutal honesty. Because at times we're not ready for it all at once. We have to kind of little by little work through it, that spiritual growth, but we're trying to work toward a brutal honesty of just being able to see things as they are, because when we do that, then we really can become healed, we can become free, life becomes a lot more simple and happy and good. So, or he writes, continuing, if someone blames him for something, he persists in explaining away his fault and not to take blame for it. So this is the self-justification, right? Instead of simply, even being willing to hear it. Maybe it's not exactly fair or not, but oftentimes if someone is coming to us with a concern, they probably have at least more of a point than we're willing to acknowledge. And this is where I think we get to last week's topic, to at least try to see our share in it, to try to recognize that there is some truth to it, rather than immediately trying to self-justify and to kind of explain it away as our default response. So similarly, it may suit him to bring charges against his brother and to continue to justify himself saying, but what did you say? Or what did you do? In other words, kind of that tendency to throw it back in their face. Well, it's like, they feel it's do this with kids a lot, but sometimes we don't outgrow it. Where someone says, well, you didn't do this well, and I say, well, you didn't do that well, right? I don't know. What might it be? You didn't do the laundry well. You didn't do the dishes, or I don't know. It's this rather than just simply say like,
you didn't help.
no, it's like no, I didn't. I messed up. I forgot. It's interesting, but this is part of that overcoming falsehood in ourselves. So again, if he wants to get something and doesn't not come to the point and says, I want this thing, he persists in saying in a roundabout way, I suffer from this and I need that thing, or I have an order from so-and-so, and he goes on telling lies to get what he wants. So this is where he's saying, so like, perhaps you imagine the monastery perspective where if they wanted or needed something, they're supposed to ask for a blessing for it because everything's communal, right? And so he's saying there's a tendency to try to make up a reason almost for why we need it, rather than just saying I want it. But I think we can do the same thing through going through these processes of self-justified as to why we want to do something or buy something or do it, rather than just kind of recognizing what is the real reason why it'd be helpful to have an example. But
I think kids do it a lot. I mean, I think we've seen a lot with at least our kids, where it's like, oh, I want this video. I need this video. And at least when they're smaller, they tend to be more willing to just say, I want this. Well, why? Like, you try to well, why do you need it? Well, I just want it. And they're more likely to say it. But as they get a little bit older, they're more likely to be like, I want it because it's the special video, and this is the time to do it, and this is what you said, and this is what you did. And it just kind of starts forming a loop. It's hard to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's there's something very prevalent phrase in society, or at least in marketing, right? This notion that you deserve it, right?
Have it your way.
Yeah, or that too. Why you should buy it? Well, you deserve this, or you. So we have to, I think, be a little bit careful. We're always kind of quick to find reasons to give ourselves what we want, rather than just saying, I want this. Do I really need it? Okay, so he says, for as much as all sins arise through a love of pleasure, avarice, or vainglory, we can say that lying has its roots in these three vices. So this is an interesting point. So he says all sins arise either from a love of pleasure, from avarice, that's from greed or wanting things, or from vainglory, from our vanity and pride. He says, so lying has its roots in these three. A man wants to avoid blame and humiliation, either to fulfill his own desires or to gain something, and he never stops turning this way and that, using every trick of speech until he accomplishes his purpose. This is kind of that, describing a really smooth talking sort of attitude, or that sweet talking to try to get what we want. And of course, some people may have developed more of a habit for it or have more of a skill for it, but we think we can. There's a tendency for anybody to be a little bit double-minded, if you will, if we are not careful. And in the end, no one believes him when he speaks the truth. No one can believe him, for the truth he speaks is ambiguous. There are times when urgent necessity arises, and unless a man conceals the bitter fact, the affair gives rise to a greater trouble and affliction. So the next section he alludes to, this is a very interesting and difficult case, is it okay at times to tell a kind of lie if the outcome of telling the truth would be worse? And he does, in a sense, make allowance for that, but with a lot of caveats. So we have to be very careful. In an extreme situation, when to tell the truth would to be reveal something that would cause great harm. It's I think to take the example he gives, but maybe to draw it more extremely right. So you imagine that somebody in Nazi Germany, right, was hiding a Jewish person or family in their house, and this has happened. And the Gestapo comes and says, "Are you hiding anyone here?" And they say, "Oh no one's here," and they go on. And they obviously told a lie, right? But they saved a life doing that. And so Abba Dorotheos, he says that this can be done, but we have to be extremely careful with fear of God and still to repent in our hearts afterwards. So we'll read what he says. So he gives kind of a similar, maybe a different example, but basically where one, in a sense, tells a lie to save the life of someone else. It says unless you dissimulate, and I think that's sort of kind of like tell a white lie, if you will, it would bring the person over to death. And he said, if this may be done in extreme necessity, but let such a person not be without anxiety, but let him repent and sorrow before God, and consider it, as I said, a time of trial, and not to become a habit, but done once and for all. So that's something to be very careful, because we can get into a way of thinking where we're always sort of doing that. I'm just covering over for the errors of others, or we'll come up with reasons why every time we tell a falsehood is really for that reason. He says, no, there can be a time and place for it, but it better be pretty extreme, and if you have to do it, you should still repent afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so he says, just as an antidote for snake poison or a powerful purge is beneficial when it's taken in time and in case of need, it does harm if taken habitually and without necessity. So it's like, say you've swallowed some poison, we'll take that example, and you have to take some, what do they call it when you take something to make you vomit?
Purgative.
Yeah, purgative to make you vomit. It's like, well, there's a certain situation where that would be beneficial, but if you're doing that all the time, you're going to cause your body a lot of harm. So it may be appropriate to dissimulate, or say to tell us this kind of lie once in a while in a case of dire necessity, but do not make a practice of it. And if the need and occasion arise, and one acts with fear and trembling, one must act with fear and trembling in the sight of God, then he will be sheltered from transgression, since he is under constraint, otherwise he would be harming himself. Because now we've seen what it means to be a liar in thought and in word, and now let's see what it means to be a liar in one's very life. We talked about this might be the definition of a life of hypocrisy. A man whose very life is a lie is one who is licentious but pretends to be chaste, a miser and speaks of almsgiving and compassion, or is ostentation and goes into raptures over poverty, not wanting to acquire the virtues he praises. So in other words, not practicing what we preach. For if he spoke of his own intention, he would first humbly confess his own weakness. So he said it would be okay if we say that I don't have this virtue, but I strive for it. But to pretend that we have it and to extol it while living another way. And this is really where those who are placed in a position of teaching or authority can come under a heavy condemnation. It's always with great fear and trembling that I know the priest will read the gospel reading during Holy Week. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! And it goes on the list of all the ways in which they were not practicing what they preached, if you will, at that time. Not that what they were doing, right? What does Jesus say? Not that you should not have done, when he speaks of you, neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and all these things. You should not have left one without the other undone. So it wasn't for what they did that they got condemned, but because they were not practicing what they preached and paying attention to the weightier, as we say, the weightier matters. So these virtues, so if they were to say, these virtues are reproach to me, I'm empty of all goodness, and after confessing his own weakness, he would have to admire and set about praising these virtues. Furthermore, he sings the praises of the virtues. When he sings the praises of his virtue, his aim is not to avoid scandalizing others, for then he would have to reason as follows. Yes, I'm wretched and suffer for it because I go on giving scandal, because I harm other souls and bring upon myself their burden as well as my own. And then he would hold that what he had sinned and therefore turned others from good. For it is part of humility to scrutinize severely one's own wrongdoing and to be sympathetic and forbearing toward one's neighbors. So this is just what we touched on before, right? Listen to that again. It is the part of humility. So a humble person will scrutinize severely one's own wrongdoing, but to be sympathetic and forbearing towards one's neighbor. But a man of this kind does not praise the said virtues in this way. Rather, he takes to himself... But he's saying one who lives a lie, one who lives a hypocrisy, doesn't live this way, but takes the virtues to himself, takes the reputation of virtue, but covers up his own disorder. So in other words, trying to, just to pretend we're living virtuously, but to, in secret, live another way. He speaks about the virtues either as if he himself possessed them, or more often to harm and catch others. No wickedness, no heresy, not even the devil himself can deceive anyone unless he counterfeits virtue. The apostle says the devil changes himself into an angel of light. So he makes this point again, as we heard before, that the devil doesn't just tempt us with straight evil. That evil just rarely shows its ugly head and all of that. But it always kind of comes mixed with good or seeming good. It kind of has that twist to it. That's why some sort of interpreted the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't just good, but it was good mixed with evil. And that sense of something that can, when you put them together, it might have that part of goodness or seeming goodness, but ultimately it's rotten in the core. So it is therefore no wonder the devil's ministers take on the appearance of ministers of justice. So therefore the falsifier, either fearing to be shamed for his lack of humility, or as I said, desiring to attract and trick someone, speaks about the virtues with praise and admiration, as if he had long acquired and practiced them. When this is the man whose very life is a lie, he's not simple, he's two-faced. He is the one thing on the inside and another on the outside. So this is what we don't want, right? We don't want to be double-minded. We don't want to be complex. And I feel like often modern people pride ourselves on being complicated. But I don't know. I know as a high schooler definitely did. It seemed to be like you want to be complex and you want to be conflicted, and very often we are at that point in life. Let's not fool ourselves. But it's very interesting and telling that the way Jesus Christ reveals, the way of the gospel and the way of the saints, is a very simple way of life. And we don't have to put on shows. We don't have to put on a mask. We don't have to put on makeup. We don't have to put on a fancy outfit. We just simply be as we are, even if that means showing our weaknesses. I know one of the recent elders and saints talked about that, how it's so much of a greater, higher spiritual state just to kind of sometimes let your sins hang out there, if you will, but to be honest about it, than it is to try to pretend another way. I don't know if we want to take that too far, but there's a certain sense in which if we're just honest about even our shortcomings, we can live a more true and simple life. So that's kind of as it comes to the end. So he says, we've spoken about falsehood, which is from the devil. Remember to speak of truth, which is of God. So let us flee falsehood, brothers, that we may be delivered from the hands of the enemy and struggle to take hold of the truth, so that we may be united to the one who said, I am the way and the truth and the life. So may God make us worthy of his truth. Amen. So that's the word on falsehood. Any other thoughts, reflections, questions? I don't either this week, but it's, as I say, it's a good reminder for us, and I think something to be aware of. And the last I noticed is some of you are not in the church yet. You're either inquiring or kind of preparing. Others have been in the church. But one thing I've noticed, and I think that experience is not unique to myself, but the more one begins to live a spiritual life, and to especially the practice of confession, you start to be more attuned to little things like this that you wouldn't have noticed before. So say, for example, and I've had this a number of times, where I say something that I had every intention of answering correctly. So, what time did you get back? I came back at 11. I said that without thinking too clearly, and then I realized, I actually got back at 10:30. And it's funny because it doesn't matter. Somehow my conscience is pricked because it wasn't true. And I mean, it's a silly example there, but I've noticed it, and I think many people have noticed as well. The more we start to live for a spiritual life, the more we strive to do that, the conscience, as we mentioned, becomes more and more sensitive to these things, where even when we don't intend to speak falsely, if we do, immediately we are kind of it's made known to us. So may that be as well. So God bless you all. We'll stop and say our prayer. It is true, thee me to bless thee, O Theotokos. Have her blessed and most pure and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee.